Simply Christianity, Chapter 9, True Confessions. I said before that Luke appears to have organised his biography in a way that encourages the reader to realise that Jesus' authority as the Christ affected people personally. This is nowhere more apparent than in the first climax of his biography in Chapter 9. The account of Christ's activities from Chapter 4 through to 9 covers the first year and a half of his public life. In another 18 months or so, his actions would wind him up in serious trouble with the political and religious authorities of his day. Right in the middle of this 3-year public career, a very significant event occurred. Jesus put his colleagues on the spot by asking them who they believed him to be. Once, while he was praying alone with his disciples close by, he asked them a question. Who do the crowds say that I am? And they answered, John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, and others that an ancient prophet has risen up. He said to them, And you, who do you say that I am? Peter answered, The Christ of God. Luke 9:18-20. As readers, we've known from the beginning that Jesus is the Christ, but as you may have noticed, Jesus has not yet formally claimed this title for himself. Instead, he appears almost to have avoided it, probably for fear that the political connotations of the term Christ for many first-century Jews may only have encouraged a militaristic fervour against the Romans and even started a kind of holy war. This is something Jesus was not at all interested in doing. Nevertheless, Jesus' public silence about his identity appears to have led to some vigorous guesswork on the part of the crowds. Some confused him with John the Baptist, another recent man of God. Others thought he stood in the tradition of one of the great prophets of the past. No one had had greater opportunity to put two and two together than Jesus' colleagues or disciples. And so when he turned to them and asked, Who do you say I am? The disciple named Peter answered with great simplicity and no doubt a high degree of reverence too. After everything he had seen over the last year or so, Jesus' authority to speak for God, to heal diseases, to forgive people's past and to call on people to follow his agenda, there was no other conclusion. This had to be the one. This had to be the Christ of God. If Luke's biography were a feature film, this moment, somewhere in the middle of the story, would be accompanied by the movie's theme music at full force and volume. The audience may even applaud out of a sense of arrival. Finally, someone had discovered the truth of Jesus' identity. He is the promised Christ. But the dramatic moment would be short-lived, for, according to Luke, no sooner does Peter arrive at the correct conclusion about Jesus' status than Jesus himself sounds a very discordant tone. And he sternly commanded them not to say this to anyone, saying, The Son of Man must suffer much, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised up. That's Luke chapter 9, verses 21-22. As I mentioned earlier, Jewish people in this period expected the Christ to arrive with power to conquer the Romans and establish God's kingdom on earth, with Israel at the centre of the action. Like his contemporaries, Peter too would have held out such hopes. But Jesus would not allow such a politicization of his role as the Christ, even for a moment. Instead, as soon as his colleagues acknowledge him as the promised Christ, he immediately informs them that his mission as the Christ does not involve conquering and crushing the national enemies of Israel, but suffering and dying at the hands of Israel's own religious and political leadership. The Christ's throne, if you can call it that, would be made of 2 large pieces of wood upon which he would be nailed. This news would have been quite a shock to his associates. Jesus had already chosen to reveal his authority in non-military forms. He taught rather than rallied forces, he healed rather than conquered, and he forgave rather than exacted judgment. This should have given away the fact that his leadership was of a completely different kind to that normally experienced in the ancient and modern world. He had not come to reign like a tyrant, but to restore men and women to the fullness of life intended for them by their Maker. Now, in Jesus' explanation to his disciples of why he had come, he makes it crystal clear that this mission of restoration would be achieved only at the expense of his own life. Why exactly Jesus' mission demanded his own suffering and death becomes a major theme of Luke's biography from this point on, and will be dealt with at a later point in the book. For now, it is worth simply pondering for ourselves Jesus' pointed questions to his colleagues. Who do you say I am?